Our first presenter is Sebastian Risi with the talk Born to Learn, Combining Innate Mechanisms and Learning in Evolving Agents. So Sebastian did his PhD in computer science at the University of Central Florida under the supervision of Kenneth Stanley. He then worked as a postdoc at Cornell University, and currently he is a professor at IT University of Copenhagen, Denmark, where he leads the Creative AI Lab and co-directs Robotics, Evolution and Art Lab. He also co-founded modl.ai, a company providing AI solutions for empowering game developers. His focus is on making machines more adaptive and creative in applications spanning a variety of domains, from robotics, video games to art and design. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and we are now ready to listen to your talk.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm very sorry that I missed the first talks or the other talks because I was traveling, but I'm very much looking forward to catching up and looking all at the recorded versions, because I already heard that there are lots of great talks that happened. Yes, so today I'm gonna talk a little bit about the research we are doing that's related to innateness. So the title of my talk is Born to Learn, Combining Innate Mechanisms and Learning in Evolving Agents. So if we look at the standard kind of reinforcement learning setup, it's oftentimes, even though reinforcement learning is motivated by how animals learn, it's quite different actually to by how animals in nature learn. So reinforcement learning oftentimes assumes you have a neural network that's, for example, controlling this robot arm, and then you're learning from trial and error, and you're assuming that nothing is known about the domain. So you start with completely random connections in your network. Oftentimes these networks, they are designed by humans, the architecture, and then the other striking difference is that during deployment, you actually freeze the whole system, and during deployment, it's very difficult for these systems to adapt to things they haven't seen while they were trained. While in nature, systems in nature are born with a lot of innate priors that allows them to help quickly, efficiently, and also that allows them to continually learn during their whole lifetime. So we don't have this clear division between a training phase and the learning training phase and the deployment phase, but it's just you're born and you're learning throughout your whole life. And I think this is a nice example in this paper by Sarge et al. Where that shows how much innate knowledge there already is from birth. So, for example, these chicks are already born with without any learning taking place. They're already born with they orient to face-like stimuli, and that then subsequently follows this imprinting, this unreinforced learning, where they get imprinted to the faces they see, and only then much later is there actually reinforcement learning when they can learn new things during their life. So there's this combination of innate knowledge, you turn to face-like stimuli, and that mechanism then facilitates other learning later in life, and then allows these animals to learn much more rapidly, because they don't assume that nothing is known about the domain at hand, but they have prior knowledge that allows them to survive in their environment and allows them to learn what they have to learn. And so this is very different to how current reinforcement learning algorithms work. That first of all that don't assume anything is known about the domain, and then because of that they take many trials to learn millions of samples to learn complicated domains. And so the approach that we are working on, which is nature inspired, is this idea of neuroevolution, where instead of using reinforcement learning, we're using ideas from artificial evolution to evolve these neural networks. And for people here not familiar with with neuroevolution. The basic idea is quite simple. So you have some way of encoding your neural networks, and your neural network interacts with its domain through actions and observations. And then at the end, you get a fitness that's just the cumulative reward at the end of an episode. And that determines the likelihood that this particular gene should reproduce, and this genotype should reproduce and create more similar networks. So basically the networks that perform well make more offspring, and the networks that don't perform well, they die out. And surprisingly, this very simple algorithm has shown to be quite competitive to reinforcement learning algorithms, first shown by Suleiman et al. In 2017, and then also a lot of work by AI Labs, where they show that this idea of evolution, neuroevolution, can be competitive in domains like these Atari domains, where they sometimes outperform other current state-of-the-art reinforcement, or at that point, current state-of-the-art reinforcement learning algorithms. And how it works is actually really, really simple. So in this deep, what's now kind of called deep neuroevolution, because everything is called deep these days, the idea is quite simple, that the simplest form of deep neuroevolution, you have a long string of the parameters of your model. You just concatenate all of them together, and then you just add Gaussian noise to these parameters. You test them, these networks in your domain, and you take the ones that perform best, and you allow them to reproduce, and you mutate them by adding Gaussian noise again. So this is basically the only thing that's currently used in this deep neuroevolution is this Gaussian mutations, or the majority. They don't even use crossover. And so it's a very, very simple approach, and that it was very surprising to a lot of people working in the field that this approach allows networks to be optimized that have millions of connections in this Atari playing game. And some people are already familiar with this picture. So I just wanted to show a picture of my cat when I was young, which gives some motivation for the things I'm going to talk about now. So this cat only had 3 legs, but it was still able to very quickly learn. It was quick to run. So it had this innate knowledge that allowed it, even though it only had 3 legs, so it lost a leg in some accident, it was able to quickly learn to adapt to this damage and quickly recover from it, because of the innate priors that this cat had, while it's still very difficult for robots to do something similar. And so this kind of then we wanted to see in a robotic system, can we create a system that has some innate knowledge that would allow it to adapt to this kind of damage and quickly kind of recover functionality? And this is the work we used artificial evolution. So how I just explained, like just adding Gaussian noise to these parameters. And so what we tested is a system where we just train the parameters of this model, which in this case is just the weights. So we evolve the weights of this model, and then we train it on both of these different morphologies. So one standard morphology and one morphology where we also cut off a leg. And then we want to see, then we test it on yet another morphology where we cut off a different leg. And then we want to see, can this robot adapt as quickly as my cat when I was a kid? And here's an example. So the robot works fine. The first 2 morphologies are the ones that has seen during training. And then the second one, the third one, this is the unseen morphology. So it's not able to know what to do anymore. So there's some components still missing from this idea that we can start these robots out with these weights, but it still limits their kind of their adaptability. And the reason for this is that in nature, it's not just about what kind of synapses the connections in our brain which we are born with, but we're also born with innate properties to modify these synapses during our lifetime. So we can still learn, and this is also part of our encoded in the genes. How does this learning happen? How can we adapt to new stimuli or situations that we haven't seen? And so the basic idea, and this is work we published at NeurIPS last year, is this idea of using what's called Hebbian plasticity. So Hebbian plasticity, often also described as what fires together wires together, that if you have two neurons that are connected that always fire together, then the connection between those two neurons becomes stronger. And so the idea we had then, and people have explored this before, but what we wanted to try is to only learn these Hebbian rules. So here's a formula of the change of the weight is related to a learning rate. That is, all of these parameters are per weight in the neural network. So each neural network has different learning rate and these parameter A, B, C, D. And so this is presynaptic activation, this is postsynaptic activation. And then we have these parameters that for each connection, we don't learn the weight at all. The only thing we learn is how much should this weight change based on the pre and postsynaptic activation of this neuron. And then we wanted to see, so this is another form of innate knowledge. It's not the weight itself, it's just the way that the weight should change based on the incoming activation that the agent gets throughout its lifetime. And so we can see here, if you quickly, I go back at the start, it's a little hard to see because it goes so quick, but basically the agent is born with a totally random neural network. So these are the weight layers that are initialized with random weights. What is learned is these parameters of these Hebbian rules. And then you can quickly see, so here we have the Hebbian network. So these are the weights of this robot. And this is just a normal static network where we don't have any lifetime learning. And what we can see is that if you look here, very quickly, they change in only a few time steps. And then they kind of have some gradual change. But what you can see here is that this robot is able to work in the first two morphologies and also still not as good as with a functioning leg, but it's still able to drag itself forward while a static neural network, static neural network that just has fixed weights is not able to perform the task anymore. So we get a little bit more robustness by allowing these systems by starting with random weights and only learning the innate learning mechanism itself. And we also tried this on this car racing domain, so like a high dimensional pixel input where it has to learn to drive this car around the track as fast as possible. And here again, you see that the weights are always, they're not static anymore. They're always changing while the agent is exploring its environment. And this whole system was optimized with evolution and has 450,000 trainable parameters. So the number of parameters is larger now because each weight has not just one parameter, each connection has not just one parameter, but each connection has 5 parameters that determine how this connection should change. And so the robot only needs, we did some experiments where we're freezing that the weights cannot change anymore after a certain number of steps, to test how many time steps does it need, the robot need to experience before it's very good in its domain. And this system, by having this innate knowledge, these innate learning rules, only needs around 30 to 80 time steps to converge on a high performing weight space. The weights are still changing, they're oscillating, but it only takes around those number of time steps. And also these systems are surprisingly robust to weight perturbations. So we thought, what would happen if we just, we replace a large block of these weights just with 0 weights. So just black them out and then see what would happen a few time steps later. And after 10 time steps, it was able to kind of, it is a slightly different weight pattern, but it was able to recover. And we can see on the right side hand, it was also able to recover its performance. So here we see episodes versus reward. So we can even remove parts of the network and it's able to recover and being able to work again. But of course, this is a very very simple model of biology where in our system, each weight is encoded directly in the parameter space. So for each connection, we have these different parameters, these different Hebbian rules. But of course, in nature, it's not quite like this. In nature, you have your DNA, and you have this process of development that creates the architecture of the brain. It creates the learning rules. So there's not this kind of one-to-one mapping between the trainable parameters. and the final phenotype, but there is some indirectness, this development. And some people argue that this kind of indirectness actually is crucial for creating a more general artificial intelligence. And this is what's also called this genomic bottleneck idea, that you have that the genome is much smaller, it's like 30,000 genes encodes trillions of synapses in our brains. So this is a much compressed, a very compressed representation of the brain that is by going through this growth process of development made into this brain. So and the genome stores these rules. It doesn't not store specific connectivity configurations, but mostly it stores these rules. How can you grow these kind of systems? And this genomic bottleneck hypothesis, also now popularized by Zador, says that because these genomes are smaller, there's some compression, they might act as regularizers and select kind of for more generic rules that allow more general learning rules to emerge. So basically, then we went back to this work on the Hebbian rules, where we encoded each connection has its own rule. So this is our previous approach. And we wanted to see, can we, by reducing the number of rules, so going more into this direction of this genomic bottleneck, by having less rules and having rule reuse, so that, for example, all these blue connections are using the same Hebbian rule, can we get the agent to be even more resilient and being able to generalize better to situations that the agent has not seen during training? And so this is what we basically did. We developed this approach, which we call evolve and merge, where initially every connection starts out with having its own ABCD rule. But then over time, we evolve these rules, and then we merge rules that are similar together through a very simple clustering approach. So we, at some point, we, for example, might see that rule 1 and 4 is very similar, so we make them the same, and then we continue optimization. And then we, over time, reduce the number of rules and the number of parameters more and more and more, increasing this kind of genomic bottleneck, the kind of compression from the parameters to the final product, which is the actual neural network, the policy network. And this is, as I said, with a very simple k-means algorithm. We merge these rules together, replace them, and further train the agent. And we can see that we can actually get, so over a number of generations here, and the score, and again, this is this quadruped robot. We can see that we start out with over 12,000 rules, but we can reduce that number to only 384 rules shared across connections in the network, and still get the same performance that we get with the much larger initial space of rules. And so this shows that it gets the same performance on the training task, those two morphologies that we have seen, but how well does it perform on morphologies that it has not seen? Because that's the hypothesis we wanted to test. So by having this shared innate rules, can you get to better generalization? And here shows you the different gates, a little bit slowed down. So we can see that it's able to do it with the original number of rules, but also with 384 rules, it's able to perform well, and is able to control the robot in much compressed space. And then what we did is we did a more systematic study where we varied the length of these different legs to a greater extent. And then we tested these different approaches. And what we can see here is that basically kind of confirming some of the genomic bottleneck hypothesis, that the static model is not able to perform well with changes in leg length, but while we reduce the number of rules, we get better generalization to these different leg lengths that were not seen during training. And so another cat picture to and for entertainment purposes. No, I actually wanted to show this because this is not the only. So I wanted to talk briefly about another innate knowledge that can help our artificial agents to learn. And this is, for example, the reflex that cats have, that they always land on their feet, which allows them to, having this kind of reflex, this kind of allows them to learn more safely. So we are already born with certain knowledge that keeps us from harm, reflexes that keep us safe, instincts that tell us, if there's some animals are born with a fear of snakes or spiders, because during evolution there was a lot of times that these animals that it's good to have that innate knowledge to be able to survive. And so the other thing we're exploring with this idea of innate knowledge is, can we give agents particular innate knowledge that allows them to learn more safely? If you're born with the fear of snakes, then you avoid those snakes while you learn other things, which allows you to learn more and stay maybe alive longer. So in this work, which we published at this Artificial Life conference, what we did is train an instinct network that is pre-trained on a task where it's safe to make mistakes. So in this case, it's colliding with these blue hazards. So it's supposed to learn that you're supposed to avoid these blue hazards. And that is the instinctual, the innate knowledge that we want the agent to encapsulate. And so we train it on a task where it's safe to make those mistakes. And once it learned this task, once we have this innate knowledge, then we can actually combine this, what we call this instinct network, with another policy network, which is trained through reinforcement learning. But the instinct network regulates the reinforcement learning network to make it not collide with these areas that might be dangerous. And this allows then the agent, being trained on a task that is where it's safe to make mistakes, to learning other tasks, but learning them in a safe way. So in this case, the agent has to learn to push these buttons, but it should learn this during its lifetime without colliding with any of these blue spots. And as we can see here, it's able to figure this out, being able to navigate to the buttons without colliding with anything, because it has this instinct network that keeps it safe. And the other task we wanted it to learn is, can it learn to push this box to the screen space? Again, learning without colliding with any of these hazards. And after a number of iterations, so the task is it's quite challenging, but after some iterations, it's then able to figure it out, pushing the box there, and during learning, suffering a much reduced number of hazard violations than a normal reinforcement learning algorithm that does not have this kind of innate knowledge about the world. And so kind of having like an outlook of where I think this could go next. So far I've shown like a very, very simple kind of indirect encoding, where we basically through this k-means algorithm, we reduce the number of rules, and then we get more generalization. But of course, in nature, these indirect encodings, how our DNA is developed and encoded into a working brain, is much more complicated. And there's a lot of desirable properties that we might want from our encoding. So we want them to create things that are, for example, symmetric. Like our brains show some symmetry. We want them to be repetitive, that they can repeat certain. If I discover like a cortical column, then I would want an algorithm to be able to repeat that neural wiring diagram throughout this artificial neural network. I want also slide things like repetition with variation. So I want all these different properties and creating a more complex indirect encoding than the one we have seen. And not only training the learning rules, but ideally this indirect encoding would grow neural networks where the architecture is determined by the algorithm, the different learning rules, the development, how that changes over time. And I think that's kind of important next steps where we want this work to go. And one approach in this direction, which is maybe it doesn't look like it has anything to do with neural networks and innateness, but basically what we did here in this work is to train a neural cellular automata, so basically like a graph neural network, to grow these different structures in Minecraft. So only starting from an initial voxel and only through local communication, this algorithm is able to perfectly grow human-made structures. We train it in a supervised way on examples of human-made structures, and it's able to grow these structures only based on the local communication of cells. And it can also create functional machines like this moving caterpillar that you can see here. And it also allows you to create things that have robustness to damage. So then we did again some not so nice experiments. We cut the caterpillar in half and wanted to see, can it regenerate and grow again, and it was able to do that. And then it was able to locomote again. So maybe now you're asking yourself, so what does it have to do with neural networks? And now we're suddenly talking about Minecraft and neural cell automata. But the basic idea, what I think we should do next is to, instead of, I would like to use the same system where only locally cells communicate, and to grow neural networks instead of having fixed architectures, fixed learning rules. So I want to grow neural networks. The intricate wiring diagrams, the ways those should change, the combination of innate knowledge and learning. And this is this neural development you, for example, see in the zebrafish. So can we create something like this in with artificial neural networks? I think would be very exciting, with the hope that these systems that have this kind of genomic bottleneck would also be more resilient to, would be better at generalizing to new things. And this is how it could look like in an first steps we're taking now, how it could look like in an artificial system, that basically where you start with a simple network, and over the lifetime of the agent, you would grow this network and you would learn how to grow and to basically to adapt. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I wanted to thank also our research group, Robotics, Evolution and Art Lab, and the Creative AI Lab, and all the collaborators on these papers that you saw here. And yes, so thank you very much for your attention. I hope that the slides can be shared, and then there's some links here. If you're interested in this field, we also a few years ago wrote this overview article with Andrea Saltoggia and Ken Stanley, Born to Learn, the Inspiration, Progress, and Future of Evolved Plastic Neural Networks, where we basically talk about a lot of the things that I here just was able to briefly mention. So I recommend you the survey paper if you're interested about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the amazing talk. Now we have some time for questions. And let me start with some, just to clear up, how exactly is danger defined in the model with the robot that collides with obstacles?
Yeah, so in this case, it's very simple, and this would have to be changed, I think, to get to more complex tasks. But basically, it gets a very large negative reward, for example, to collide with these hazard blocks in that environment. So that's basically that we decided that these hazard blocks is something that should get a large negative reward, and then we use that to train this instinct network. So and now we're exploring how could we use this for like simulated autonomous driving, where, for example, the instinct network would have to learn to avoid like pedestrians. It would have to learn to avoid with and in simulation, of course, not in the real world, and to not collide with houses and all these things. That would be what that instinct network was supposed to learn.
Thank you. I think we have a question from one of the panelists. It's Richard Samuels. You can ask the question now.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really interesting. I had a question which was really just out of inquisitiveness. So you mentioned that when you reduce the number of rules, you can still have adaptability in the system. I wondered whether or not you, in doing these sorts of studies, you noticed any regularities in what happens if you reduce the rules too small. So if you reduce the set of rules below a certain threshold, do you find that there are sort of replicable patterns in how performance falls off?
Yeah, so we also found that was basically the limit, what we showed, those 300 something. So basically, if you go lower than this, then there's not enough information, I think, to being able to solve the task at hand. So yeah, there's definitely you can only go so far with the compression, and then it doesn't work that well anymore.
Great, thanks.
I'd like to follow up on that if I could. Actually,
sure.
Can you go back to your slide, Sebastian, where you showed the
Sure.
results of that experiment?
This one?
No, the one with the reductions. Yes, this one here. Okay. So it looks like there's not a huge improvement once you get past, say, 6,000 rules, but you have a high variation in the amount of variability. So with 384 rules, you have a lot more variability. Do you have a sense of what's going on?
Yeah, I think this is all. This is I think the reason for this is, so we saw some improvement, but as you said, the improvement is not so much. I think this approach is very kind of brittle to this kind of manual tuning, because we're doing this kind of k-means clustering, and sometimes that works well, but if basically because in k-means you cannot go, like, once you clustered something together, you cannot really go back. Yeah. And so that is something that is not ideal with this approach. So that's why we are now also trying to extend that part of the approach, but that's why it has more, there's a little bit more variability in that once you got to a lower number of rules.
Did you see any patterns in say the input layers having different rules than the output layers, things like that?
We tried to analyze this. You can kind of see, so here there is some the kind of rule counts, but it was really difficult to see any discernible pattern. Like it was not so much. We also looked at other different layers that have different patterns, but I think we might have to also, we only apply this to this domain. So I think to get general insights, it would have to be a larger number of domains where we study this a little bit more systematically.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, constant problem. Yes, so thank you very much for an amazing talk. It was hugely inspiring. I just wanted to ask about the last section that you mentioned about what you are going to do in the part of the research when you want to actually simulate development. It may be a stupid question, but what would you like to evolve in those models, like the rules of wiring, the rules of plasticity, or both?
Everything. So I would like to evolve, like, how those cells divide, how they form networks, the way the learning rules. So also in the case of the Hebbian rules, the rules we have are also very limited by those 5 parameters. But we have some earlier results from this method that I developed together with Ken Stanley called adaptive hyperneed, where you can actually learn a function that tells you how much you should change the weights. Like, instead of limiting it to these kind of Hebbian-like rules, you can have a function that takes the current weight as input, the pre and post-synaptic activation, and then outputs how much it should change. It can learn like a nonlinear weight update rules. So I think all of these things somehow, I think we could unify using something similar to this kind of neural cellular automata in growing these structures.
I see. Thank you very much.